It is September the 13th, 1940. 3 months previously, on June the 10th, Italy had joined her Axis ally Germany in war against the British. Upon war's outbreak in Poland in 1939, Italy had declared itself non-belligerent, had played a waiting game. But Hitler's war machine had moved fast. Mussolini had no alternative now but to actively enter the conflict. The war was extended to the Mediterranean and Africa as the Italians joined the victorious Germans. Now the Italian army was about to embark on a venture to win themselves a great empire and assure them a position as one of the major powers on earth. The Battle of North Africa begins. The Italian plan was this. From Ethiopia, one army under the Duke of Aosta was to advance upon Egypt from the south. Another, under Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, was to drive east from Libya. Combined strength of the two armies totaled 500,000 men. Their opponents, hard-pressed at home, feeling the weight of the Nazi blitz against England, mustered 100,000 British and Commonwealth troops. The Italian attack began well. Graziani's forces struck at Egypt. The fall of France had secured their rear in Tunisia. England was fighting for its life in the Battle of Britain. So the Italians advanced into Egypt as far as Sidi Barrani. It was the greatest opportunity Italy had to increase her empire. These troops might have raced through Egypt and joined with the other Italian force in Ethiopia. But the goal of a great empire turned into an illusion, ultimately to disaster. The dreams of glory promulgated by Il Duce did not match with reality. The desert terrain was fearsome. Although the Italians dreamt of glory, the hard work involved in attaining it was another matter. The troops were often sick, always homesick. Morale became low. Italian tacticians made many mistakes. These mistakes proved costly. Under General Wavell, British forces surprised them at Sidi Barrani on December the 9th. The Italians had dallied there. Mussolini had threatened Graziani with loss of command if they didn't move on into Egypt. Now too late. British armor raced along the Libyan coast. Marshal Graziani had made a costly error by turning these coastal towns into fortresses, walled with barbed wire, guns, and anti-tank ditches. They would prove to be no match for the highly mobile British. El Solam, Bardia, Tobruk, Derma. One after another, the towns fell to the British. Benghazi. The Italians made a hasty exit, retired from the city. They were cut off by fast-moving armor and motorized infantry. The Italian army was trapped. British Empire forces captured over 133,000 prisoners. Their own losses, 604 men. By February the 8th, 1941, they occupied the eastern half of Libya, as far as the town of El Agila. General Wavell's victory in Libya protected Egypt on the west and left him free to destroy the Italian army in Ethiopia. The blitzkrieg tactics used by Germany so successfully were now employed by the British against the Axis partner. Under orders from Rome, the Duke of Aosta made a last stand, but by May the 19th, all Italian resistance had ended. Ethiopia, first of the fascist conquests, was liberated. The Emperor Haile Selassie returned to his kingdom. In Libya, British troops halted at El Aguila. The weakening of the British forces coincided with the arrival in Africa of a man who was to become of historic importance. February the 12th, 1941, General Erwin Rommel, veteran of the Polish and French campaigns, arrived to take command of the Africa Corps. By March the 11th, the 5th Panzer Regiment had completed its disembarkation in Tripoli, equipped with 120 tanks and the most modern and fearsome of German war equipment. The Africa Corps had been extensively trained for desert warfare. The men represented the best of the much vaunted Nazi culture. Special equipment for the troops had been provided by the Tropical Institute at Hamburg. The Africa Corps comprised 2 armored divisions, each with 8,000 men and 135 tanks, plus the crack 90th Light Infantry Division. Rommel attacked the weakened British position on March the 24th. He continued to advance, the British continued to withdraw. On April the 1st, the Germans moved into Benghazi. Rommel had seized the initiative. He proved a formidable foe who commanded respect even though serving in the enemy cause. His strategy in using the Orson Mark III and Mark IV tanks, which outranged the British in firepower, was amazingly skillful. The British were forced to stabilize their forces farther to the east. The British had been pushed back into Egypt, but the retreat was not complete. One Australian division remained in Tobruk, a constant threat to Rommel's flank. Nazi propagandist Lord Haw called them the Rats of Tobruk. The term became an endearing one. The efforts to dislodge them cost Rommel time and strength. The area of Tobruk was about twice the size of the District of Columbia. The town itself consisted of plain one-story stucco buildings arranged in half a dozen crisscrossing streets. Rommel's intention was to attack Tobruk as quickly as possible, before the British had recovered from the onslaught of the Africa Corps. The combined offensive he ordered on April the 10th was brought to a halt. His attacks on the 11th and 14th were also unsuccessful. By May the 2nd, Rommel had taken Solem, Capuzzo, had reconquered the rest of Cyrenaica. Tobruk held on. Rommel's greatest attack had failed to dislodge the gallant and heroic opposition. Few of the men in Tobruk ever had a roof over their heads. Strip life of everything that makes it worthwhile, and you have the standard of living in Tobruk at this time. Water was scant. Rations were merely a means of keeping alive. Only the essentials came through. Supply lines from air and sea were worth their weight in gold. The story of the desert in the summer of 1941 was the story of Tobruk. At the end of August, the Australian garrison was relieved. And colonial empire forces moved in. Tobruk was a severe thorn in the side of Rommel. This fine port, under British control, forced the Germans to move 1,500 tons of supplies daily over open desert wastes. Tobruk was sorely needed as a supply point close to the front. Thus, the siege was strengthened during September. On the morning of December the 4th, Rommel launched a heavy attack that was very nearly successful. The war in North Africa teetered back and forth. On May the 26th, 1942, the German offensive was launched in full force. Said Rommel, "To every man of us, Tobruk was a symbol of British resistance, and we were now going to finish it for good." Tobruk fell at 5 a.m. June the 21st, 1942. On June the 22nd, Rommel learned from Hitler's headquarters that he was a field marshal. Wrote Rommel to his wife, "I would much rather he had given me one more division." The prize Rommel had sought for over a year was finally his. At great cost to both sides. June the 30th. The Axis forces came to the El Alamein line. Alexandria was 65 miles away. The Germans had won a great victory at Tobruk and were moving rapidly. Field Marshal Rommel was at the peak of his professional career. It was at this time that General Auchinleck received a distinguished visitor from England. Mr. Churchill stayed for 5 days. Other new arrivals remained permanently. They were General Sir Harold R.L.G. Alexander, who replaced General Auchinleck as commander of the Middle East, and General Sir Bernard L. Montgomery, who took over General Rich's 8th Army. Your prime and main duty will be to take or destroy at the earliest opportunity the German and Italian army commanded by Field Marshal Rommel, together with all its supplies and establishments in Egypt and Libya. Signed, Winston Churchill. General Montgomery took hold at El Alamein. Meanwhile, Lend-Lease supplies rolled in. President Roosevelt ordered every spare Sherman tank shipped to North Africa. Both sides were girding for what obviously was to be a decisive battle. The British plan for the forthcoming Battle of El Alamein was to be the turning point in the Desert War. That was certain. All prayed that it should turn in their favor. The plan itself was simple. Blow a hole in the German positions, send in strong armor, and keep widening the gap. The Axis line at El Alamein was a maze of strong points for 35 miles. During October 1942, they were hit mercilessly from the air. Axis shipping was badly damaged. Thus, the stage was set. There was no secrecy about the British plan. General Montgomery had made it known to every man. In a personal message to his troops, he said, "The battle which is now about to begin will be one of the decisive battles of history. It will be the turning point of the war. The eyes of the whole world will be on us, watching anxiously which way the battle will swing. We can give them their answer at once. It will swing our way." Montgomery had said, "Give me a fortnight and I can resist the German attack. Give me 3 weeks and I can defeat the Boche. Give me a month and I will chase him out of Africa." Thus he instilled in his troops his own supreme confidence. They prepared. Guns ready. Equipment ready. Men ready. Rommel's troops were confident. German and Italian radios began promising complete independence for the Egyptian people and made dates for the Africa Corps with the ladies of Cairo and Alexandria upon their victory. October the 23rd, 1942, afternoon. While they could, Montgomery's men also relaxed and waited. In late afternoon, the British forces moved to the assembly areas. 9:40 p.m. A still desert night. The Battle of El Alamein begins. Guns had broken the silence. The roar was heard in Alexandria, over 60 miles away. The 8th Army was unleashed. General Montgomery chose the north to make a breakthrough. It would threaten the coastal road, which was the enemy's life, and would imperil his forces to the south. By dawn on the 24th, the Axis main defenses were bitten deep. Their Luftwaffe tried to halt Montgomery's forces in vain. British air power blasted them from the skies. By the 27th, all Axis reserve strength had concentrated in the north. An advanced position called Kidney Ridge was counterattacked 5 times in a single day by the 15th Panzers, but held out. October the 29th. After bitter fighting, the 9th Australian Division advanced due north across the coast road to a strong point known as Thompson's Post. There they stayed, while the enemy was hit by the RAF. Gradually, the enemy was drawn to the north. It was the moment General Montgomery had been waiting for. With Rommel concentrating everything to the north, gaps in the line were made to the south. And during November the 2nd and 3rd, the whole weight of the 8th Army poured west. The Germans were caught off balance. Taking advantage of the enemy's weakness, the British forces broke through all along the line. Said Rommel, "We were completely stunned. For the first time during the African campaign, I did not know what to do." His army was relentlessly pushed back. On came the British. back past the old familiar places. Hordes of prisoners were taken. The Axis had suffered its first great defeat. The tide had turned, and already in the United States and Britain, preparations were underway for the invasion of North Africa on a scale never before equaled in military history. It was, as Winston Churchill said, the end of the beginning.
We continue our story. It begins with a conference in Washington, where secret plans are made for a large-scale invasion of North Africa.
The Washington Conference was top level. Prime Minister Churchill arrived from London. High-ranking members of the military staffs were present. The results of that conference were kept secret. Few knew of the tremendous plan formulated there, which would call for preparations on a scale never before equaled in military history. The Allied invasion of North Africa. There were 123 days in which to get ready. Hundreds of ships to be prepared. Ships armed and loaded with some 700,000 items of equipment. Tons of supplies, stockpiled for what was to come. Vast numbers of troops suddenly found themselves engaged in intensive training. As the days passed, it was evident that something big was at hand. Big enough to involve a maximum effort from two continents, from both Britain and America. But what? October 24, 1942. While the British 8th Army was smashing Rommel and the Germans at El Alamein, a vast troop convoy set sail from American ports. The next day, two convoys left Britain. In all, 3 convoys, 700 ships, traveling 5,000 miles. As yet, the men aboard the convoys had no scope of their undertaking. Nothing to do but relax and wonder. Destination unknown. Speculations plentiful. Rumors even more so. As the days crawled by, tension mounted. What lay ahead for them and where? Finally, the secret was out. North Africa. The men were fully aware of the bitter fighting waged there for 3 years, of the Africa Corps and Tobruk. And as the convoy steamed onward, a bulletin was received of the retreat of the German army, resulting from the shattering El Alamein battle. The plan, invasion. The objective, rout the Axis powers from North Africa. The invasion was to be made hundreds of miles west of El Alamein at 3 points: Casablanca, Oran, Algiers. General Mark Clark had previously landed in Algeria to confer with French officers. General Henri Giraud would lead the Free French forces. The entire operation was under the command of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, appointed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. At 3 a.m. on November 8th, the convoys converged west of Gibraltar. The events planned 4 months ago were about to become history. Now, everything depended upon taking the enemy by surprise. Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. speaks.
Soldiers and sailors, it is not known whether the French African army will contest our landing. But all resistance, by whomever offered, must be destroyed. However, when any of the French soldiers seek to surrender, you will accept it and treat them with the respect due a brave opponent and future ally.
This was Casablanca, the northwest corner of Africa. H hour. The invasion began. The ensuing events now in the hands of fate. It was also H hour at Algiers. Planes based at Gibraltar flew over to give extra insurance for the success of the operation. And it was a success. Opposition in Algiers was slight. In a short time, it was in Allied hands. Oran, H hour. Here the paratroops went into action. Fighting was bitter. But after 2 hard days, troops of the enemy Vichy French capitulated. Oran was taken. 2 down, 1 to go. But at the Atlantic port of Casablanca, there was trouble. The Vichy French Navy still fought for the Axis. Fighting on the water was heavy. Allied guns pounded the port and the Vichy fleet. The battle lasted for 5 grueling days. But on November 12, Vichy Deputy Chief of State Admiral Darlan reached an agreement with General Eisenhower and ordered all French in Africa to cooperate with the Allies. Resistance ceased at Casablanca. The troops rolled in. Of the prisoners taken, none seemed to be very popular with the civilians. The greatest invasion in military history was a success. The enemy had been taken by surprise. The first phase in the Allied invasion of North Africa was over. In addition to General Eisenhower, the British First Army was commanded by General Anderson. The French troops were under General Giraud. The next step, move east swiftly. Time was precious. The Allies moved toward the Tunisian border, hoping to reach Bizerte and Tunis before the Germans could rush in reinforcements. We pushed on, despite all but impossible roads and shoddy railroad facilities. But still we moved on, by land and in the air, which was our best means of transportation. And it was by air that the German forces struck back. As they did, German reinforcements poured in from Sicily. November 18, the Allied advance guards entered Tunisia. Our line of supply was now 500 miles long. Moving fast. We had to. By November 22, the town of Beja was reached. Mejaz al-Bab, the terrain became more and more precarious. November 25, at Mejaz al-Bab, the first tank battle occurred. The Germans lost 15 tanks and withdrew. They moved back to the mountain approaches in the northern tip of Tunisia. At Matur, they waited. We attempted a thrust. It was all important. Time was running out. Winter was coming. This time, we failed. The Germans were too strongly emplaced. We fell back. The Tunisian front was now stabilized on a line running north and south from Mejaz al-Bab. For the North African winter had come. The war bogged down in a morass of mud. Hopes for a lightning victory in North Africa were forgotten. Airfields were flooded. Bad roads became worse. With the line stabilized, the war became a waiting game. reports at the time would say action was light on the Tunisian front. Actually, this light action accounted for half our casualties in the campaign. During this time, patrols were sent out continuously. If they were lucky, a few of the captive enemy would be returned. Sometimes they weren't so lucky. In the clouds, there was more activity. In a single week, Allied planes destroyed 241 enemy aircraft. We lost 89. From our bases, it was possible to make devastating attacks on Italy, Sardinia, and Sicily. But the main activity during this lull was the Battle of Supply. Both sides girded themselves. The British 8th Army was racing west from Libya to meet us. In Tunisia, the winter would soon be over. The crucial struggle loomed ahead. But there was one day when the struggle was momentarily forgotten. A day dedicated to peace on earth. Christmas in Tunisia, 1942. January 14, 1943. American troops in Casablanca were startled to see a familiar face from home. The president arrived. And Prime Minister Churchill came. General Charles de Gaulle and General Giraud were brought together to unite the fighting men of France. The Casablanca Conference was underway. It was held to set the requirements for victory, not only in North Africa, but all over the world. The ultimate object, no appeasement, no negotiation, nothing short of complete victory over the enemy. In the Civil War, General Grant had first used the term. Now President Roosevelt used it, unconditional surrender. The stage was set. After the conference, Mr. Churchill flew to Tripoli and greeted General Montgomery. The climax in North Africa was approaching. But there was still fight in the enemy. The veteran 21st Panzer Division attacked, and German armor overran the Kasserine Pass. However, infantry and artillery support from the 9th and 34th Divisions, plus British units and bombers, stopped the Germans and drove them back through the pass. Though a setback to the Allies, there was something gained. The troops became, in General Eisenhower's words, battle-wise and tactically efficient. It was the last Nazi offensive in Africa. By this time, the British 8th Army had caught up with Rommel's forces at the Mareth Line. On March 15, 1943, Rommel was recalled to Germany. He never returned. His army had retired to the Mareth Line's fortified hills. With the Americans at Magnassi and the French to the south, Montgomery kept up a pounding assault on the line to divide Axis reserves. Pinning the enemy in front, he flanked to the left and delivered a telling blow. The New Zealanders moved on this flank. The 4th Indian Division circled the rear. American armor closed in, supported by heavy air assault. And the Meerut line cracked. The Nazis abandoned the field with Allied armor on their heels. The battle-wise 1st Armored Division pushed east to cut off the enemy retreat. General Patton saw them close on the enemy flank. April 7, 1943, a big day. British patrols met advance guards of the American 2nd Corps on the Gab Road. Thus, Allied lines were linked. Now the British 8th could be supplied from North African ports, and troops could be shuttled along the entire Tunisian front. The U.S. 2nd Corps, under General Bradley, moved north to the Beja Road, which ran to Bizerti. The end was in sight. April 20, the British 8th opened the final offensive. Anfidaville was taken, and the natives began to return to their homes. Relentlessly, the Allies pushed onward to Bizerti and Tunis. The going was slow, tough, and dangerous because the enemy was holed up in the surrounding hills. Key positions often changed hands several times before the German defenders were forced to fall back. Hill after hill was stormed or flanked in bitter fighting. Our big attack was at Jabal Tahent, Hill 609. It was a main enemy position. On April 28 and 29, the enemy laid down a heavy mortar fire, and we replied with artillery as we attempted to storm the heights. The going was rough. On May 1, we took Hill 609. The plan for victory in the northern tip of Tunisia had been likened to a cylinder, a machine to compress the enemy until he was destroyed. The compression was about to show results. Swiftly, one by one, the towns on the road to Tunis and Bizerti fell. Matur, Massacolt, Ferryville. There was no stopping the Allied push now. The enemy found themselves forced into a pocket from which there was no escape. The Nazis may have invented the blitzkrieg. We were improving on it. The armor forged ahead. Tanks broke through enemy lines. On May 7, 1943, the Germans were surprised by the Allied arrival outside Tunis. There was no organized resistance. For the Germans, there was no front left. The town of Tunis was turned into a carnival. The streets were so full of crowds and celebrations, traffic could hardly move. The same day, May 7th, at almost the same hour, we entered Bizerte. The reception here was not so jubilant. Hitler had ordered his troops to fight to the last cartridge, but there was no fight to the finish. Still fond of parades and brass bands, they marched in. Total, wholesale surrender. Among the 267,000 prisoners taken were 14 German and 4 Italian generals. Although our losses were relatively light, we had destroyed 250 enemy tanks and 2,330 aircraft. Now Air Marshal Tedder launched a furious assault upon Italian islands off the Tunisian coast. By June 13, the last ones were taken. The conquest of North Africa was complete. Now the Middle East was safe. Africa was liberated. And from there came re-echoing the phrase that would be fulfilled in the invasion of Italy, D-Day, VE Day, unconditional surrender. El Alamein had been the end of the beginning. For the Axis powers, it was now the beginning of the end.
The ominous advance of our armies in Sicily drove the desperate people of Italy to frenzied riots and demands for peace. On 25th July 1943, Benito Mussolini was overthrown. The new head of the Italian government, Marshal Badoglio, opened secret peace negotiations with the Allies. To fully exploit the collapse of the fascist regime, immediate invasion of the mainland of Italy was imperative. The Italian Navy was almost intact. Mussolini was out, but his Nazified war machine was still a threat. Our plan was to break up the Italian military organization before the Germans could take over. Nazi equipment and troops came pouring down into Italy. Hitler had anticipated the collapse of Mussolini's regime and lost no time strengthening the defenses of southern Italy. Allied strategy called for a preliminary British attack on the Calabrian Peninsula, followed 6 days later by a combined Allied attack on the Gulf of Salerno and another British attack to the south. By invading Italy at 3 points, we hoped to throw the enemy forces into confusion. Naples was the #1 objective. Its capture could give us the use of a first-class harbor. Our bombers had blasted strategic points for 2 months. At dawn on September 3rd, the British crossed the narrow strait from Sicily to Italy. In the various ports of the Mediterranean, units of the combined British and American armies were assembled for the attack on the Gulf of Salerno. Vessels of all categories rushed to the Mediterranean from other theaters, provided barely enough shipping space to transport our men and equipment. At Oran in Africa, the 36th Division embarked to go into battle for the first time. They were scheduled to spearhead the invasion in the American zone. The 45th Division embarked at Palermo. These hardened troops were scheduled to reinforce the initial assault troops. General Clark and Admiral Hewitt worked together. Convoy units left Oran, Bizerte, and Tripoli on the 5th and 6th of September. Our troops were told of the unconditional surrender of Italy on the same day. Here was the first break in the coils of a war that gripped the whole world. The bulk of the Italian fleet, by prearrangement, sailed to Malta. Italian airmen flew their planes to Allied air bases in Tunisia. Formal surrender closed this chapter of Italian history. Meanwhile, on the heights above Salerno, the Nazis were preparing a deadly reception for the Fifth Army. They zeroed their gun batteries on every foot of the beach. On the eve of the assault, they were ready and waiting for us. Allied strategy called for attacks by the British 10th Corps on the left and the American 6th Corps on the right, with the Sele River as the corps boundary. The success of our invasion hung on the speed with which we could cross the coastal plain to the wall of mountains 8 to 10 miles inland. At dawn, September 9th, the 36th Division hit the beach without cover of a naval barrage. The Nazis, having anticipated the landing, pinned our combat teams down with interdiction fire. Nazi dive bombers slashed at our transports and warships. They scored some damaging hits. Reinforcements from the 45th Division were moored ashore at critical points to stand off the German counterattacks. Our tanks came ashore to support the hard-pressed infantry. We continued to pour men and equipment into the narrow strip of land along the Gulf of Salerno. Allied naval guns threw their utmost support to the hard-pressed ground forces. The cruiser Savannah fought up and down the shoreline. Casualties were heartbreakingly heavy. The Savannah was forced to withdraw. German field artillery, emplaced in the hills directly above the British invasion beach, pounded the British landing forces. After a savage struggle, British commandos took the town of Salerno. Units of the British 10th Corps drove across the open plains toward the Nazi airfield at Monte Carino. We desperately needed a fighter plane air base in Italy. Construction of an air base in the American zone, out of range of German artillery, was started on D+2. The first strip was completed in 24 hours. Planes began using the field before it was ready for normal operation. Crash landings were common during the first few days. Artillery was a key factor in beating off the main German counterattacks. British forces advancing steadily from the toe and heel of the peninsula forced the Germans to withdraw from southern Italy. On September 16th, contact between the 8th Army and the 5th Army was made south of the Salerno beachhead. In the ruins of an ancient Greek temple in the American sector, we set up a well-equipped first aid station and evacuation center. Extremely heavy casualties had been the price of victory for the 36th and 45th Divisions. Divisions of the British 10th Corps, too, had suffered heavily. Fresh troops moved into the line. We drove ahead, close on the heels of the retreating enemy. Our main objective, Naples. Through Battipaglia, the battle for the beachhead had raged 3 times. Taken, lost, and now retaken, this war-torn little town, which had been filled with attractive, substantial homes only a week before, had become a fantastic heap of ruins. In 8 days, the Fifth Army advanced 30 miles against the sullenly retreating Germans. Eboli, shattered by our advancing artillery, was evacuated without a fight. Campania was practically wiped out. At Cassino, we raced through. In some towns, our troops were frequently delayed by small rear guard detachments, which had to be blasted out one at a time. German prisoners were interrogated on the field and gave our intelligence officers some valuable information. Destroyed bridges slowed our advance, enabling the Nazis to keep ahead of us by that vital one step. The 6th Corps moved into position to take the mountains east of Naples. Near the coast, the British 10th Corps struck northwest through the mountains to the Sorrento Peninsula. On October 1st, the Fifth Army marched into Naples. The Nazis had evacuated their forces from the city, but not before they had vented their rage on it. Liberated civilians who had risen against the Germans on their last day greeted the Allied troops hysterically. With typical German savagery, the city had been torn apart. There was no water, no sanitation, no fire protection. The city was on the verge of complete moral collapse. The Nazis had sunk ships alongside the docks and dumped cranes and freight cars on top of them. The railroad yards were a shambles. Huge caves and demolished buildings served as bomb shelters and homes for thousands of Neapolitans. Many had known no other homes for more than a year. Those who had fled from the fury of the Germans returned to find their homes looted and burned. The Allied military government, after a quick survey, took over the food distribution of the city. A time bomb planted in the post office exploded a week after the Germans fled the city. More than 100 people were blown to death, most of them civilians, many of them children. Thus, and in many other bestial ways, did Hitler and his generals seek revenge on their former Axis partners. Before the war, along the 7.5 miles of Naples waterfront, there had been 14 berths for ocean-going vessels and innumerable docks for smaller craft. The wrecked harbor was handed over to 12,000 sea beams, and miraculously soon it was back in operation. Indeed, in a short time, it was handling more shipping than before the war. We now had an adequate port for our coming operations up through the shank of the boot. Thousands of tons of food were brought in for distribution to the civilian population of Naples. The Allied military government set up a rationing system and appointed trustworthy Italian officials to supervise its execution. Within a few months, the city began to show a new face. The empty shells of buildings were torn down, and the salvaged material was used to erect new structures. There was still starvation. War was still nearby. But among the populace, normal human relations were again possible. A feeling of security began to grow. With the capture of Naples, the armies of the United Nations gained their first major port on the continent. The Allied invasion of Italy was the first significant breach in Hitler's Fortress Europe. By early October 1943, the Allied armies in Italy had attained their initial strategic objective. The British 8th Army now held the vital network of air, while General Clark's American 5th Army captured Naples, a major seaport where supplies and troops could be landed. By keeping pressure on the enemy in Italy, the Allies hoped to keep German troops from the critical Russian front. The German 10th Army withdrew to the hills north of the Volturno and prepared for a determined stand. Our first obstacle, the Volturno, a river winding through mountain and valley to the sea. 3 days' rain had caused the river to rise 6 feet. At some points, it had overflown its banks, swelling to a width of 200 to 300 feet. On 8th October, the 5th Army, made up of the 10th British Corps and 6th American Corps, was deployed along the southern bank of the river. The British 10th Corps front extended from the coast to Capua. The American 6th Corps area extended 35 miles east from Capua to the rocky slopes of the Matesa Range. Midnight 12th October, the 6th Division struck simultaneously on a 40-mile front. The enemy gave ground. Early the next morning, engineers, wet and cold, still wearing summer issue, fought the rough Volturno. Engineers supporting the 34th Division lost equipment, had to change location twice because of enemy fire. The river was 70 feet wider at this location. Against all obstacles, the bridge was completed. 2 days later, 15th October, over our newly constructed span of Triflisco Gap, British Bren gun carriers crossed the Volturno. The crossing of the Volturno was a battle of construction and supply. With equipment and supporting weapons moving steadily across our bridges, the battle had been won, and the 6th Corps was ready to pursue the retreating enemy. At Alvignano, occupied the morning of 17th October, Major General Ryder, commander of the 34th, ordered Colonel Butler, commanding the 168th Infantry, to drive on to Dragogne, 2 miles to the northwest. On our right flank, the 36th Artillery supported the 45th Division. This assault struck at the last line of hills, barring the approach to the upper Volturno Valley. Casualties were high. In a single day, the 6th Corps lost 545 men. One regiment lost 3 battalion commanders in 12 days. In early October, American-Japanese fighters of the 100th Infantry Battalion arrived at Alvignano. Composed entirely of 2nd and 3rd generation Americans, this outfit was alerted for immediate action in the 34th Division zone. All along the front, we killed and captured enemy rearguard forces who fought delaying action. By 18th October, the 3rd and 34th Divisions were converging on Dragogne. Throughout the day, the 3rd Division shelled Dragogne. The next day, the town was occupied by the 168th without opposition. Some prisoners from the 3rd Panzer Grenadier and 26th Panzer Divisions were taken. They reported heavy casualties. The 45th Division, attacking northeast from Fecchio, advanced to Piedmonte d'Alife, supporting a second crossing of the Volturno by the 34th. 45th Artillery barraged a small village, while the 34th fired on the Alife-Piedmonte road. The infantry pushed over rough terrain. By 20th October, Piedmonte d'Alife and the nearby town of Alife were both occupied. Our forward troops were pressing the enemy close. But now, in order to keep men, vehicles, and supplies moving, a great battle of reconstruction began. A treadway bridge constructed with the aid of a mobile crane. Our advance depended on our engineers. They worked fast. It wasn't only demolitions which faced American engineers. There was continuous rain, culverts to be dug, entirely new roads constructed. The war in Italy has been frequently called the War of Roads and Bridges. Infantry and engineers fought as a team. Enemy demolitions were calculated to hold us up for more than 24 hours. But in a matter of a few hours, bridges and approaches were in operation again. The 45th Division, in action ever since it landed at Salerno, withdrew into Corps Reserve. The 34th and 3rd pushed northward, driving for the Capriatre of Volturno and for the opening in the mountains near Mignano, known as the Mignano Gap. Elements of the 34th, held back by the enemy for 2 days, entered Prata the 29th October. On our left flank, the 3rd Division on 27th October advanced over the heavily mined road to Pietrovillamo. Medics of the 3rd Division gave wounded German soldiers more consideration than they bargained for. Civilians also needed medical care. General Truscott's 3rd Division fighters had driven the enemy from several mountain heights. They were showing signs of exhaustion. In the Venafro area on 3rd November, the 6th Corps crossed the Volturno for the 3rd time. The 3rd Division continued to press against Mignano. 504th Parachute Infantry on the right drove high into the mountains and guarded 5th Army's right flank. The 34th Division above Capriati crossed the river north of Venafro. The 45th Division moved up from Corps Reserve through Venafro and drove to push the Germans from the mountains beyond. Once more, our engineers faced the task of bridging the Volturno. Wind and rain continued. On 4th November, the Volturno, lashed by a wind of hurricane velocity, changed overnight into a raging torrent. Against all difficulties, bridges had to be replaced quickly to keep supplies moving. Wherever possible, light vehicles crossed over the riverbed. The November rain came down unceasingly. Bivouac areas became flooded fields of mud. Military operations came almost to a standstill. Roads were stretches of mire that became deeper as we pushed into the mountains. Streams flooded over their banks, washed away temporary bridges and bypasses. All along the front, vehicles bogged down in mud. It was a back-breaking job to drain the almost liquid mud from the roads. The forward movement of men and supplies became slower and slower. In the mountains, water gushed across the surfaced roads and roadbeds were washed out. By mid-November, transportation was almost at a standstill. Precious time lost, which the Germans used skillfully to build a new, strong line of defense. The German winter line in the mountains above Mignano and Venafro. An immediate offensive against this line was impossible. There was too much work to be done behind our line, on bridges made useless by the enemy and the weather, on roads which were constantly a serious problem. Rock quarries supplied tons of crushed stone needed to fill in mud-soaked roads. From the front to far behind the lines, preparation went on for the 5th Army offensive against the German winter line. In the mountains were miles of trails over which supplies could be carried only on the backs of mules. The average Italian mule could support 220 pounds. 250 mules were required to supply the basic needs of an infantry regiment in the line. There could have been no winter campaign without mules. On the flats, our trucks could churn through the mud. On the highest slopes, only men carrying light loads could make the ascent. Between these two extremes, the use of mules was an absolute necessity. After 2 weeks on 1st December, we were ready to attack the winter line. On the right, the 6th Corps with the 34th and 45th Divisions was in contact with the British 8th Army. On the left, the British 10th Corps was made up of the 46th and 56th Divisions, poised to cross the Garigliano River. At this time, a new corps, the 2nd, was brought into the center of the line and assigned command of the 36th and 3rd Division. Attached to this corps were the 1st Special Service Force, highly trained American and Canadian troops, the 1st Italian Motorized Group, and the American 1st Armored Division. This force was concentrated against the Mignano Gap, which we had to enter in order to break through to the Liri Valley, which led to Rome. The Mignano Gap is a narrow valley squeezed between mountain masses, Mount Cassino to the south and Mount Samucro to the north, on the side of which is built the town of San Pietro. Like a stopper in this bottleneck, Mount Lungo rises from the floor of this valley. Beyond Mount Lungo, there were further mountain barriers, including Mount Trocchio. Our offensive started with Operation Raincoat, code name for a thrust on the left of Mignano Gap at the Camino Hills. Late afternoon, 2nd December, 925 field pieces poured tons of shells into enemy positions. Backed by this strong artillery support, the 1st Special Service Force captured Mount La Defensa and Mount La Rematagna. The 56th Division took Mount Camino. The 36th captured Mount Maggiore. By 10th December, Operation Raincoat was completed successfully. Troops of the 1st Italian Motorized Group moved into the Mignano area to join the 36th Division. This marked the first occasion of Italian soldiers fighting side by side with Americans. It was decided that Italian troops should strike to take Mount Lungo. A 2nd Corps artillery barrage supported the effort. The Germans were too well entrenched on Mount Lungo. By noon, it was apparent that the Italian assault had failed. Losses were so excessive that further operations against Mount Lungo were postponed for the time being. Instead, we decided to take the town of San Pietro at the foot of the mountains. Now our artillery pounded and repounded the enemy defenses guarding San Pietro. The next day, the 504th paratroopers were sent out to secure the hills above San Pietro. Mules carried their weapons and ammunition up the steep slopes. On 15th December, a week after their first attempt, the 143rd Regiment again moved into position for an attack on the town. German planes came over to dive bomb our positions. Smoke screens were thrown up to conceal our movements. On the narrow, heavily mined road to San Pietro, 16 tanks under direct enemy observation led the way for the infantry assault. The lead tank, 3 hours later, reached the edge of San Pietro. Enemy shells fired on the tank, hitting closer and closer before knocking it out. At the end of the day, only 4 of the 16 tanks returned. Enemy decision to abandon San Pietro came after we'd won Mount Lungo. On 17th December, our lines moved into the town. From the hills above, the 504th Parachute troops descended on San Pietro. No matter how hasty their retreat, the Germans never failed to leave their mines and booby traps in the rubble of a destroyed Italian town. Few prisoners were taken in the battle for San Pietro. The German withdrawal was well executed. It was a costly battle. The 143rd Regiment alone required 1,100 replacements. Many companies lost all their officers. Enlisted men led those battered units forward. This was the scene of 3 weeks of the bitterest fighting on the 5th Army front. For 17 days, the target for the heaviest artillery concentration of the Italian campaign. The people of San Pietro came out of the caves in which they had hidden for weeks. They found little of their belongings to salvage. 2 days after the battle, General Eisenhower visited the San Pietro area for a conference with division commanders. From the hills above the town, the general could see our shells falling 2 miles northwest on the town of San Vittore, our next objective. In mud, rain, in cold, biting wind, our troops had driven the enemy from Mount Lungo, reaching the top by 16th December. This finally opened the way through the Mignano Gap. Troops of the 142nd on the mountain were relieved by the 15th Infantry, 3rd Division. While the battle for San Pietro was being fought, on our right flank, the 34th and 45th made diversionary attacks high in the mountains. On 15th December, the 6th Corps was poised for an offensive to coincide with the taking of San Pietro. Moroccan troops executed a wide envelopment of the German left flank, while 2 battalions of French Gaumiers prepared to advance west through high mountains to attack toward Cardito. Mountain fighting on this front was the most difficult of the campaign. In 6 days, the 6th Corps gained 3 miles, keeping pace with the 2nd Corps at San Pietro. Gaumiers, accustomed to quick stabs in mountain warfare, proved a valuable arm to the 5th Army. With the approach of Christmas, the 5th Army made every attempt to provide a turkey dinner to men in foxholes all along the front. From field kitchens, the dinner, packed in Marmite cans, was brought up the steep roads into the mountains. At the end of the jeep trails, mules carried the jugs farther into the heights. Higher, where terrain was too rough for mules, soldiers brought up turkey and Christmas mail by hand. Christmas Day, 1943, at the front, 45th Division sector. Along the entire 5th Army front, the holiday of good cheer was celebrated in the cold, desolate Italian mountains. Christmas Day was not a holiday everywhere over the world in 1943. On 28th December, the bodies of 3rd Division dead, killed defending Mount Lungo, were carried down the mountain. Because of the difficult terrain, it was 3 days before they could be brought down for burial. There was a short period of inactivity at Mount Samukro, while the 2nd Corps regrouped forces and brought up fresh troops to initiate the final phase of the Winter Line campaign. On 1st January, the 2nd Corps saluted the new year with an artillery salvo on German defenses guarding San Vittore. Smoke rose from the stone houses and narrow streets of San Vittore. Shells fell on enemy entrenchments on Mount La Chiaia to the northwest. With control of Mignano Gap, the heights flanking Highway 6 were all that remained of the Winter Line. Following the opening attack, 3 more attacks beat against the remaining enemy positions. Mortar and artillery fire burst out over the entire 2nd Corps front. American bombers joined the assault. We were smashing into the last strong points of the Winter Line. The 168th Infantry outflanked Mount La Chiaia and struck west to capture Savaro on 12th January. At the same time, the 135th Infantry fought to take San Vittore. After 3 days, on 7th January, the last of fierce street fighting ended. The town, although severely damaged, was not as hard hit as San Pietro. In the Winter Line campaign, we had taken a large toll of enemy equipment and captured over 2,000 soldiers. As San Vittore fell, the 6th Armored Infantry on the 2nd Corps left flank drove to Mount Porcia, south of the important Highway 6. 3 German infantry companies of the Hermann Goering Panzer Division were rushed in by the enemy to hold the mountain. Though the Germans created some confusion, our reinforced troops held on to their guns. On 7th January, with tank and artillery fire blazing behind them, our infantry reached the crest of Mount Porcia. 8 days later, our 135th Infantry reached the top of Mount Trocchio, the last height of the Winter Line. Now the 5th Army stood before Cassino, guarding Highway number 6, the road to Rome. Here, tall, cliff-faced mountains, like an endless row of fortresses, cut across Italy. Around this natural barrier, the Germans built a new line. The main anchor of this line was in the ring of high mountains around Cassino. The town lay at the foot of Monastery Hill. At the top of the hill, overlooking the town, was the historic abbey, founded in the year 529. Built as a refuge for work and prayer, this impressive monument contained many medieval treasures the Nazis removed for what they called safekeeping. The enemy denied that the abbey was being used for any military purpose whatsoever. But with the occupation of the abbey, the Germans were in full control of Cassino, as this captured film shows. After 2 costly major attacks failed, we could no longer respect the Vatican request that the monument be spared. Leaflets were fired warning Italians to evacuate. A few days later, wave after wave of our planes came over Monastery Hill. In 4 hours, 500 tons of bombs were dropped to level the abbey. The enemy waited until the bombs stopped falling and our guns were silent, then crawled out of their holes and filtered back into the ruins of the abbey. They took up new observation and artillery positions. We had reached a grim crisis. Before us, the town, Cassino, blocked our entrance to highway number 6 and Rome. Four months of fighting against almost every obstruction known to warfare. A struggle too long, too bitter, to be fought to a standstill by an old Italian town in the hands of an enemy. For the Fifth Army advance to continue, Cassino had to be ours, even if it meant blasting the town off the face of the earth.